Greetings. We're delighted to have you join us for this special event, a virtual roundtable on Chinese sharp power in Africa. I'm Deborah BRAUTIGAM, the director of CARI. This is the 5th day of our virtual China-Africa Research Initiative annual conference, which showcases the work of our current year's research fellows and brings them into conversation with other experts. This year's theme has been strategic interests, security implications, China, Africa, and the rest. We're grateful to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for funding that allows us to pursue evidence-based analysis of China-Africa engagement. Before I introduce today's roundtable and our moderator, we have a little housekeeping. Our wonderful program coordinator, Marie Foster, will be including links to longer speaker bios and additional information in the chat function on Zoom. If you have questions, you can type these into the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screens. When you're typing your question, please let us know if your question should be addressed to a particular speaker. A recording of today's event will be made available on our website about 3 to 5 working days after the event. So in 2017, the term sharp power entered our vocabulary in a study published by the National Endowment for Democracy. The term itself is a play, of course, on soft power, which was introduced in 1990 by Joseph Nye. Soft power, of course, is the idea that nations could advance their interests not only through hard power, using coercion and economic inducements, but through the attractiveness of their culture and their values and the way they comport themselves in the world. So sharp power seems to be, and we'll hear more about it, a subset of hard power. It's a kind of information warfare. It includes covert activities that advance the nation's interests using a significant degree of deception. For example, secret funding for political parties, manipulation of social media, a deliberate circulation of fake news, and so on. We have one of the architects of the sharp power notion here with us today, Christopher Walker, and we'll hear from him in a minute. I'm sure he'll elaborate on the concept. So as academics, today we want to query the concept, and as part of the public square, we want to know about the evidence for this in Africa. To moderate this roundtable, we are fortunate to have Ambassador David SHINN. Ambassador SHINN served for 37 years in the US Foreign Service, including as ambassador to Burkina Faso and to Ethiopia. He earned his PhD at George Washington University, and since 2001, he's been teaching at his alma mater at the Elliott School of International Affairs. Ambassador SHINN is also the co-author of a well-regarded book, China and Africa, A Century of Engagement. Ambassador SHINN, over to you.
Thanks, Deborah, for the nice introduction, and I want to thank the organizers of the China-Africa Research Initiative for putting together not only this event today, but for the events of the past week and the remaining events later this week. I think it's been an extraordinary grouping of discussions of security-related issues concerning China and Africa. The event today is different than those that we have seen so far. It's not a presentation of papers. It is a roundtable discussion. It's by design a different kind of arrangement. And I'm hoping, quite frankly, that it will be a more controversial event than those that we have seen up to this point, and perhaps will even follow in the remainder of this week. I hope we come out of this session with a clearer understanding of what sharp power is, so participants can decide if it is a useful concept. And I must confess that you can put me in the skeptic column. But let me begin by putting the cat among the pigeons. We've all heard and probably used the terms soft power and hard power, and we generally understand what they mean. But I'm tripping over the term sharp power, which seems to be aimed exclusively at authoritarian states. I also question whether the term has any meaning distinguishable from long-standing terminology. Authoritarian influence efforts are said to be sharp in the sense that they pierce, penetrate, or perforate the political and information environments in the targeted countries. It's clever wording, but what is so unique about this? Governments around the world, including those in the West, engage in propaganda campaigns, today admittedly not as outrageous as those propagated by China and Russia, but propaganda nevertheless. Covert disinformation campaigns are and have been a global phenomenon for many centuries. They've not been banned in the West. Are these activities sharp power? And if so, why do they need a new label? And why do they apply only to authoritarian states? China's Confucius Institutes are often cited as the classic example of sharp power because they put academic freedom at risk on university campuses by partially financing the institute, engaging in self-censorship, and providing a one-sided account of sensitive issues such as China's core interests in Xinjiang or Hong Kong. Yes, Confucius Institutes do all that, which makes Henban an arm of China's propaganda operation. Nothing new here. I've met with the leadership of Confucius Institutes at universities in Kenya, South Africa, and Namibia, and discussed their operations at length. They also teach Chinese, and they send students on scholarships to Chinese universities, both soft power activities. Why not just call Confucius Institutes part of China's propaganda operation rather than give them a clever new name? Sharp power also raises the question of how you categorize Western political conditionality, an old-fashioned arm twisting, which occur frequently and are not always transparent. Are they sharp power or hard power? What is the difference? With that, I hope the cat has scattered the pigeons and perhaps even caught one. Now let me introduce the speakers. We have an outstanding group of speakers this morning. Very pleased to begin with Christopher Walker, who is Vice President for Studies and Analysis, the National Endowment for Democracy, a private nonprofit foundation dedicated to the growth and strengthening of democratic institutions around the world. He oversees the department responsible for analytical work. I'm going to introduce all the speakers at once rather than interrupt between each presentation. Elena Benabdallah is Assistant Professor at Wake Forest University and Research Fellow at SAIS CARI. She is the author of Shaping the Future of Power, Knowledge, Production, and Network Building in China-Africa Relations. Her research has appeared in academic journals and publications such as the Washington Post Monkey Cage and Foreign Policy. David Shulman is Senior Advisor at the International Republican Institute, where he oversees the organization's work addressing the influence of China and other autocracies on democratic institutions and governance in countries around the world. He is an adjunct senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security. Jude Moore is a senior policy fellow at the Center for Global Development. He was previously Liberia's Minister of Public Works with oversight on the construction and maintenance of public infrastructure. He focused on infrastructure financing in Africa, governance, and Africa's response to external actors. Jamie Monson is Director of the African Studies Center, Professor of History, Michigan State University. Her book, Africa's Freedom Railway, How a Chinese Development Project Changed Lives and Livelihoods in Tanzania, explores the Tazara Railway, built with Chinese development aid in the 1970s. She's currently working on a new book on the history of China-Africa engagement. I turn first to Christopher Walker, who has 5 minutes to make comments in this first round.
So I'd first of all like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to speak with everyone. I think Ambassador SHINN's introduction was provocative and very useful, and given how profoundly the world has changed, some of the assumptions we've had about the way power would be exercised also need to be at a minimum reflected on, and I'm hopeful that this discussion will help us in this regard. I'd like to start, first of all, by making the observation that China's influence is global in scope, and its engagement in Africa can't be seen in a vacuum. It's instead part of a bigger global story that relates to China's rise. And China's rise, moreover, is itself a part of an even larger story of authoritarian resurgence over the past decade and a half that's been an unmistakable feature of the global political landscape. China, along with Russia, is today exerting forms of influence beyond borders in ways that would have been scarcely imaginable even as recently as the mid-2000s. But in the most recent period, and especially in the last several years, important research and independent journalism has helped to shine a light on the adverse effects on democratic integrity of China's global engagement. As investigative journalists, civil society groups, and researchers have unearthed some of the ways in which the Chinese party state engages in open societies, we've tended to get a better view of some of the negative impacts on this kind of engagement on democratic institutions and free expression. This is critically important, I would argue, because Beijing's preference, as is Moscow's preference, is for working directly and exclusively with executive branch elites in its engagement with foreign governments, typically to the exclusion of local civil society and independent media. The Chinese authorities brook no dissent at home. Independent media, civil society, and opposition aren't tolerated. The depredations in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Tibet, and repression experienced by so many voices within the PRC is a testament to this reality today. And as China has become more assertive internationally, barely a day goes by without a new revelation of Beijing's efforts at censorship or political manipulation in countries with political systems of all stripes, including democracies. Given time constraints now, I won't go into detail, but countries as diverse as Australia, the Czech Republic, Ecuador, and many, many others are now being viewed in the lens of the Chinese party state's efforts to compromise free expression and compromise the integrity of independent institutions in these countries and many others. In the United States, a seminal report produced jointly by the Asia Society and the Hoover Institution in November 2018 detailed how the US is contending with challenges in a wide number of domains presented by the Chinese authorities and their surrogates. Even an influential global institution such as the National Basketball Association is not immune, as the general manager of the NBA's Houston Rockets learned on the basis of a stray tweet relating to mass protests in Hong Kong. These examples aren't exhaustive, but the key point I would contend is that these regimes, with China at the forefront, have subjected countries in a growing number of settings to activities that are aimed at inducing censorship and adversely influencing democratic standards and values. So how does this relate to Africa? Africa doesn't escape the global patterns of China's engagement. As with the examples in other parts of the world, in Africa, reporting and analysis increasingly is putting into the public domain activities that are inconsistent with open expression, transparency, and pluralism. Here are just a few examples that have come to light in the recent past, as reported by a variety of analysts and news outlets. Azad Essa, a journalist in South Africa, published an article that criticized China's treatment of the Xinjiang Uyghur population and subsequently found his column was removed from the newspaper, whose owners were Chinese CCP-linked companies, leading to questions of censorship. At CGTN, China's global television network Nairobi headquarters, journalists are reluctant to report news that is critical of China and must instead publish material that favors CCP preferences. Moreover, censors in Beijing are known to remove articles about human rights abuses and Africa debt to China, as well as stories that criticize the government. The Chinese government provides training and exchange visits to China for African journalists, but little to no journalistic training is actually provided. Such programs emphasize learning how to report from the Chinese government's official perspective. Of the Confucius Institutes, which have proliferated in Africa and are embedded in dozens of universities across the continent, scholar John Fitzgerald observes that Chinese academic models, which combine Confucian and Leninist ideology, prioritize authoritarian leadership and CCP interests rather than free inquiry and expression, and as such, cooperation between universities in open settings and Chinese universities work against academic freedom. In the technology sphere, the stakes are growing in Africa as elsewhere with respect to Chinese engagement. For example, the opaque circumstances in which the Chinese company StarTimes was enlisted to manage Ghana's digital migration should give pause. What appear to be ad hoc episodes of censorship at a certain point take the shape of a pattern. In his excellent new book, Chinese Media in Africa, Umeka Umeji lays out in detail the ways in which China's vast engagement in Africa's media sphere can compromise essential values of investigative journalism and reporting that is dedicated to holding powerful actors to account. And so in conclusion, just some reflections on how we should understand this engagement, how we've framed the sharp power idea and its effects on open societies, including those in Africa. First, I would stress that it isn't the case that Chinese authorities must export their model in order to exert an adverse impact on democratic institutions and values. These ideas are not binary. It's possible for China's engagement to exert corrosive impacts on democratic values without the model being exported. As my colleagues and I detailed in our 2017 report, Beijing's approach seeks to neutralize, reduce, and preempt challenges to the CCP's presentation of itself. Its state-funded research centers, media outlets, people-to-people exchange programs, and network of Confucius institutes often mimic civil society initiatives that in democracies function independently of government. But in China's case, such institutions do not operate independent of the government in Beijing, which itself operates on the basis of unchecked power and brooks no dissent. Over time, China has established platforms for educational, cultural, and other forms of influence within many societies. These initiatives tend to be accompanied by an authoritarian determination to monopolize ideas, suppress alternative narratives, and exploit partner institutions, what we've called sharp power. In contrast to institutions like the Confucius Institute, which, as Ambassador SHINN alluded to, is a state-managed, CCP-aligned entity, institutions like the Goethe Institute and Alliance Française operate outside of state control and are not embedded in university structures, which make them distinct in this regard. So let me just conclude by saying, given the massive changes that have occurred in recent years, there is a need for far more developed local capacity in many countries around the world that are grappling with China's exertion of influence, including in Africa, so that these societies themselves can recognize and respond to influence that isn't consistent with free expression, accountability, and democratic governance more fundamentally. Thanks very much for your attention, and I look forward to the later parts of this discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Christopher. And now if we could turn to Lina.
Thank you so much, Ambassador SHINN. Thank you to the conference organizers for this opportunity to speak on this important topic. My remarks will actually also be centered on the question of Confucius Institutes in Africa. And I'll make an attempt at laying out three sub-parts or sub-arguments about why sharp power sort of has pronounced limitations analyzing Confucius Institutes in Africa. And I am really excited about this conversation, and I hope that it sort of eliminates, various ways of thinking about different aspects of power and how they relate to China's engagement with Africans. And so the first important point that I wanted to make is that generalizing what we know about Confucius Institutes in the US or what we know about Confucius Institutes and how they operate in Europe to the rest of the world and especially to Africa is problematic on several grounds. So first of which is that Confucius Institutes in Africa are negotiated differently. They are built and staffed, sometimes renovated in terms of the actual physical buildings, and they are run differently than their counterparts in Europe or the US. And this is a topic that colleagues such as Dr. Kenneth King, Falk Hartig, or Madalena Procopio, among others, have worked on for years. But just looking at sort of what we know about this is when we follow the details of how a Confucius Institute is negotiated and opened at a university in an African country, we see that we're talking about very different institutions, very different models, and very different products. So Confucius Institutes are not necessarily the same in Africa as they are in the US. And what we see oftentimes is that in the case of Confucius Institutes, in my own experience looking at Addis Ababa University Confucius Institute, the Chinese side basically renovated the entire physical institute itself within the University of Addis Ababa. So, you know, it's held embedded within the Department of Languages, but it was renovated by the Chinese side. It was also equipped by China and also staffed by China. Now, you know, in my interviews with several high-ranking officials and several university officials in Addis about the Confucius Institute and whether they fear losing control over what goes in the curriculum or in extracurricular and cultural activities, the responses I got made me feel like I was asking the wrong questions altogether. And in reflecting as why I was asking those wrong questions, I came to understand that the way I viewed Confucius Institutes was basically understood from the perspective of what I know about Confucius Institutes and how they operate here in the US and US universities. But it would be problematic actually here to assume that the deans and these officials don't know what exactly they are bargaining for. Or what they're giving up, or what the calculations are in allowing Confucius Institutes to open, or not allowing, actually in asking and applying and trying to get Confucius Institutes to open in the universities. But my understanding is in their calculations, they stand to win a whole lot more than they stand to give up in terms of control and in terms of self-censorship, etc. So, you know, for the dean of the school, it's not a bad deal at all when hundreds of students are going to benefit from language classes, from tuition, from cultural experiences, from scholarships to go study, you know, in China, and from allowing these students to have the language skills that are going to let them have better jobs, and the better jobs are going to improve their living conditions. And so there is a materiality there as well that's connected to learning Chinese and Chinese in Confucius Institutes that is very important to these officials. And so the related point that I wanted to bring up here, which is my second point about the Confucius Institutes, is that, you know, questions that I've asked in the context of Confucius Institute in Addis Ababa University, you know, do not necessarily cover all the experiences of Confucius Institutes all across the continent. Africa is very diverse. It's a huge continent, and the experiences are not necessarily going to be extendable and generalizable over the entire continent. But this is something more about the concepts, several concepts in IR in general, including soft power, hard power, smart power, but also sharp power, which are concepts that are oftentimes designed with the US or some European state in mind as the starting point, and then they get generalized to the entire continent of Africa. So when we're looking at China's foreign policy or China's engagement with the US, and then we take that as sort of a starting point to generalize to Africa, then we run into several issues. And then these several issues are because sometimes Africa is viewed as sort of one single unit, and that all African countries in some ways represent, you know, the same opportunity for China to engage through these institutions and get, you know, and I think that it's important to problematize that and to say that that China, the way that China operates in these countries is not necessarily sort of across the board homogeneous. The last point, and I wrap up here, is that from the prism of viewing Confucius Institutes in Africa from the prism of soft or sharp power, is that Chinese government institutions do not have a lot of competition in Africa when it comes to investments in human capital development. So you know, this means that unless there are other modalities of offering foreign language instruction that challenges in practice the Chinese modality of going about this, then we should not expect deans and higher education officials in African universities to just drop their partnerships with CIs, Confucius Institutes, because, you know, as Chris mentioned earlier, you know, Goethe Institutes and Alliance Française are very different. They actually do not offer language instructions in the sense of sort of tuition and language degrees, etc. And so, I'll stop here, and we'll look forward to talking more about this. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Lina. And now if we could turn to David.
Thanks very much, Ambassador Shinn. Thank you to the organizers for having me, and it's a real pleasure to be on this panel with so many experts on this subject. In my brief time, I'll address China's intentions in Africa and the role that sharp power and other means of building influence play in achieving them, talk about the impact of the Chinese Communist Party's efforts on democracies in Africa, and close with a bit on building resilience. So first, it's important to point out that the Chinese government is not principally interested in undermining democracy in individual countries in Africa. China's main interest in dealing with Africa remains economic, not ideological. But nevertheless, as a byproduct of its influence in African countries, sharp or otherwise, China is weakening democracy. So to first apply this to questions around Chinese investment, there's little evidence that Beijing is plotting debt traps to seize strategic assets. But this is the extreme version of the debt trap narrative, which is somewhat of a straw man, and which gives China a pass on the arguably more pernicious consequences of what Chinese state-owned enterprises and policy banks are doing to seek maximum advantage. That is, using the lack of transparency in many countries, the existence of officials all too willing to be corrupted, and to conclude lopsided, opaque deals that result in reduced democratic accountability, a cycle of dependence on China for financing, and critically, the capture of elites, which is a fundamental aspect of China's sharp power. China's sharp power tactics are used in Africa largely to protect those expanding economic interests, and also increasingly to shape narratives on China's gross human rights violations. China does this by cultivating so-called friends of China and manipulating the information and political space, as Chris described. Various elements of the party state are involved in these efforts: the Central Propaganda Department, the United Front Work Department, and numerous seemingly innocuous cultural and friendship organizations that look like the soft power civil society institutions in democratic societies, but are actually instruments of the party state. In terms of the media domain, Chris touched on the journalist trainings that more than 1,000 African journalists are participating in every year, and the work of Emeka Umeje. He also noted that China is directly investing in the African media market, with the biggest case of direct involvement being StarTimes, which has strong ties to the Chinese government and 25 million subscribers in more than 30 countries in Africa. I'll just add that research by Kenyan investigative journalist Edwin Okoth finds that official Chinese outlets are often free on StarTimes, which reaches over 16,000 Kenyan households, while Western media outlets are behind significant paywalls. And as a result, many Kenyans interested in China are consuming the party's curated narrative of China's policies and engagement in Kenya. And the most important Kenyan media outlets, meanwhile, have content sharing deals with Chinese official media, with that content often unlabeled as such. And not surprisingly, there's consistent messaging in many of these outlets parroting China's propaganda. Now, this does not mean that China dominates Kenya's or any African country's media market, far from it. But China is shaping the information space, and there is strong anecdotal evidence about self-censorship around China topics and the threat of removal for criticizing China in outlets with significant investment. So it's not a big leap to posit that the expected growth of China's involvement in Africa's media sector will only lead to more uncritical, rosy coverage of China and its investment deals. China is also cultivating thought leaders and blocking voices critical of China in the academic and think tank domain, beyond Confucius Institute, which we've talked about a lot already and which get a lot of attention. For example, a number of Chinese and African universities recently agreed to conduct joint research initiatives on the benefits of the Belt and Road Initiative, spurred by a new Chinese government-backed institute. This is part of the Chinese party state's drive to develop think tank alliances around the world in support of the BRI, which play the role of, quote, policy promoters, public opinion guides, and consensus aggregators, consistent with President Xi Jinping's directive to view Chinese think tanks as instruments of the party that should help realize China's strategic objectives. So again, like the cultural and friendship organizations, these think tank networks take the form of what we have in democratic society. But the goal is not objective intellectual inquiry, but rather to serve the party and its interests. Lastly, as China's sharp power is subverting democratic institutions and processes, China is also popularizing authoritarianism as part of its engagement with many African countries. The party is not trying to transfer its political model, export Marxism, set up little mini Chinese communist parties. The Soviet Union is not the appropriate analogy here, but it is offering governance solutions, absence of civil society involvement, lacking any assumption of democratic political process or an independent media, or really any true participation from those outside of the government, that is, outside of the elites that China can influence, as Chris noted. A Key vector for this influence is building party-to-party ties undertaken by the Chinese Communist Party's International Department. So to look briefly at Kenya again, there's been a marked increase in Chinese Communist Party exchanges and trainings with the ruling Jubilee Party since Xi Jinping came to power. Of course, many political parties have international exchanges, but exchanges with the Chinese Communist Party often invariably involve training on its approach to authoritarian governments. In 2016, the party began extending annual scholarships for Jubilee members to attend party trainings in China, as well as Chinese Communist Party orchestrated trainings in all 47 counties of Kenya for local party members. Broadly, the CCP typically trains African political party members on its organizational structure, propaganda, and shaping of public opinion. China also trains African officials on its approach to internet control, censorship, and surveillance. For many illiberal actors in Africa and elsewhere, this is a tempting package: investment without conditions, opportunities for personal enrichment, and training on how to stay in power. And I'll close briefly, because I know I'm out of time, and just say that yes, this is absolutely a two-way street. African countries have agency. China is not corrupting the innocent, but China is using these sharp power tactics that are intentionally difficult to expose to increasing effect. And this points up the importance of ensuring democratic actors have the knowledge and the capacity to hold their own officials' feet to the fire and mobilize for democratic resilience and engage with China and take Chinese investment as they will, but do so in a way that ensures that their democracy and their national independence remains protected. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, David. And now, Gyude, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David. And again, my thanks to SAIS for CARI for inviting me here today. And hopefully this conversation is productive. So I too have just uncertainties about the efficacy and the point of naming sharp power. I think it's just the West's penchant for naming things, because authoritarian states have always existed and they've always done things this way in terms of promoting their narratives. I think what I wanted to do in the time allotted to me was to just talk about, from the perspective of an African government, from the perspective of those upon whom this sharp power, or whatever it is being enacted. Because looking at it, I don't know if there's a big difference, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. One is that the drivers of African foreign policy are more prosaic and proximate. So African foreign policy doesn't tend to be very expansive in terms of defense of shared values and norms. It's not as if Africans do not value those. It's just that the bandwidth for dealing with foreign policy on the continent is usually absorbed and exhausted by more proximate causes. So for example, Rwanda is a lot more concerned about its border relations with Uganda, Kenya with Somalia because of Al-Shabaab, Nigeria with its border with Benin. So those are the kinds of things in terms of foreign policy of African states. It's a lot more proximate. And because of that, there are a few instances where there are cross purposes with what the narrative that China wants to present. So the Australian Strategic Policy Institute calls this, it doesn't call it sharp power, it calls it coercive diplomacy. And it has documented about 152 incidents in the last 10 years in 27 countries. But the study notes that very little of that occurs in Africa. Very little of that occurs in Latin America. And a part of the reason is simply because, as I said, what drives foreign policy in most African countries is not a defense of, say, human rights everywhere. It's more proximate. And because of that, it allows, there's not that much friction between the two. The second thing I would say is that calling it sharp power in terms of what China does, especially on the continent, as if there's a distinction in Africa between what China is doing and what other powerful countries have done. It's almost like when the rise of, say, public diplomacy is when the US and the West and their allies do it, it's called public diplomacy. When others do it, it's called propaganda. It's sort of like, let's call what they're doing sharp power. So coercive diplomacy or sharp power, or this description of an othering of what China is doing, when I think it's the same thing that the West does, and we call it doing foreign policy with carrots and sticks. Every country in pursuit of its national interests will deploy assets that are available to that country. And it is true that Chinese investment in Africa's media space, Chinese investment in African infrastructure gives China an inordinate control, inordinate influence over some of the decisions that African governments make. But from the African perspective, especially from the perspective of the average African citizen, how is this different from what France does? Now, of course, with us in terms of foreign policy elite and people who are significantly more educated, we can, parse the nuance in terms of the differences. But for the average African who sees an external actor in their space dominating or having significant influence over the government, how is it different from what China does and what, say, France or the UK does? So from the perspective of African governments, there's not much of a difference in kind, or from African citizens themselves, there's not much of a difference in kind. The final thing that I would say on this point, in terms of Chinese sharp power on the continent, is that in documenting, as the Australian Strategic Policy Institute does, documenting instances of Chinese, say, coercive diplomacy, or how China has responded when its narrative has been challenged, I think it's also important for African governments to pay attention to that. Simply because we saw again in Botswana, for example, Botswana was planning to have the Dalai Lama visit, and the Chinese government responded very harshly to that. And I remember President Ian Khama saying that Botswana was not a colony of China. And I think it's important for African governments to be able to see what happens when a country runs afoul of the narrative that China is trying to present. We have a saying back home that if you have a peculiar condition and you want to note how people with that condition are treated when they are. So I think for African countries who are dealing with China, it's important for them to be able to step back and see how China responds when this narrative is challenged. But to close, insofar as sharp power is concerned, I think for countries on whom Western and powerful states enact their foreign policy, it is difficult for us to be able to distinguish between, say, sharp power and diplomacy on the part of the West. Thank you.
Judy, thank you very much for your comments. And moving on to our last speaker for the first round, Jamie Monson.
Thank you very much, Ambassador SHINN. And I also would like to thank Deborah and Yoon and Marie and all the other hardworking people behind the scenes that organized this conference and this panel. In my brief remarks, I will also provide some reflections on the concept of sharp power, and I approach this as a historian. The concept may have some useful application for the United States or Australia or Canada, but I have strong reservations about its use for Africa and for Africa-China engagement. Not only are there major differences among world regions and within Africa, as Lina pointed out, but this concept must be understood in the context of Africa's own history, including its history with the United States. I'm only going to be able to provide a couple of examples, but I hope they'll help provoke some discussion. Sharp power is primarily used by US authors and mainly for describing China, sometimes for describing Russia. To my knowledge, no African states or commentators have used the phrase. It doesn't have a theoretical foundation, which may explain why few academics have taken it up. But the framing of the sharp power context carries on a tradition from earlier historical periods when Africans were warned by the West of the dangers of engaging directly with China. Sharp power sends a similar warning today, telling Africans how they should think and act in relationship to China. Sharp power frames Chinese activities as, and I quote, covert, coercive, and corrupt. This implicitly positions other powers, especially the United States, as transparent, benign, and moral. And it distracts attention from the troubling weaknesses of US foreign policy towards Africa. The characterization of Chinese actors as covert, secretive, untrustworthy, and corrupt or immoral has a long history in Africa and the world. In 1903, on the Rand in South Africa, Colonial officials said that Chinese had morals and habits unlike those of European races, and that in Africa they would reverse the struggle for advancement and civilization. And Karen Harris at the University of Pretoria has done amazing work on some of these historical discourses. But what I'd like to turn to, and what I find more troubling, is the way application of the sharp power concept reinforces enduring historical myths about Africans and their leaders as innately incapable of comprehending and responding to the Chinese threat. In 1954, President Eisenhower said that Africans were not ready to govern themselves. He said, and I quote, "They lack the innate capacity to withstand communist advances." Assistant Secretary of State at the time said that because Africans were unprepared to meet the communist aggression, freedom from colonialism would endanger not only Africans, but the entire free world. Eisenhower advocated at the time for maintaining strong colonial linkages. And scholars who are writing today about China-Africa people-to-people engagement and the United Front continue to depict African leaders as naive, emotional, and easily duped by China. In her recent book on global Maoism, Julia Lavelle used strings of emotional adjectives to describe the responses of African leaders and other visitors who went to China in the mid-20th century. Her adjectives for Africans were words like exuberant, admiring, marveling, and ardent. When describing first president of Tanzania, Julius Nyerere's visit to China, she said that he fell in love with self-reliance. And when the Tazara Railway was being constructed, Western observers like the World Bank said that President Nyerere and President Kaunda were too emotional about the possibility of a new railway link in Pan-African solidarity. This kind of scholarship continues to portray Africans as irrational, immature, and in need of guidance from the West. It's because words have power that we must interrogate them. Who is using them, when, why, and to what ends? These words revive and recirculate long-held stereotypes about Chinese and Africans. Today, there are very real concerns being raised in Africa by Africans about Chinese engagement, not only in media and censorship, but also in critical areas like mining, fisheries, and the debt financing for infrastructure projects. We need to meet these concerns with theoretically robust, empirically grounded, and Africa-centered analysis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jamie. That concludes the first round of 5-minute interventions by all of the speakers. We're going to move now into a shorter round, about 3 minutes each, of comments that anyone would like to make on this topic or on anything that previous speakers have said. I'm going to begin. Before I do, just a reminder, if you have questions, start sending them in so that we can get feedback from you and perhaps engage in an even livelier discussion. I want to start with a point that David Shulman made, which I agree with. He indicated that China is weakening democracy in Africa. I accept that. China is as supportive of authoritarian regimes in Africa as it is democratic regimes. It really doesn't distinguish. Whichever government is in power is quite acceptable to China. But China does go beyond that in that it tries to establish strong party-to-party relationships with parties in Africa, with ruling parties in Africa. Interestingly, it does it without a great deal of discrimination as to whether they are authoritarian or not. When we were doing research in China in 2017, we were constantly surprised, not surprised, but I guess we were intrigued to hear from various leaders in the Chinese Communist Party and elsewhere that the Communist Party's best student in Africa was the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, the EPRDF. And we heard that from a number of our Chinese colleagues. DPRDF is now defunct. It's disappeared as a party. It's been replaced by a combination of the Prosperity Party and a whole series of minor parties. But it's true that it was a very authoritarian regime in Ethiopia, and it's true that it got along famously with the Communist Party of China. But interestingly, the other very strong link between the Communist Party of China and an African political party is the African National Congress in South Africa, which is not seen as a particularly authoritarian party. Yet it has one of the strongest links of any party in Africa with the CPC. So in that sense, I think China contributes in a negative way to democratization in Africa by supporting authoritarian regimes to a much greater extent than Western countries do. I don't rule out that there is Western support for some authoritarian regimes in Africa, but I think China is more aggressive at this. I sort of leave the comments in the first round still struggling with the distinction between sharp power and just routine government propaganda and covert operations. I think that these are perfectly good terms to describe what has been happening for many decades in relationships between African countries and other countries around the world. And I'm not sure that sharp power really adds to the definition. And particularly when the definition of sharp power is seemingly confined to authoritarian regimes. It may be that the countries like China and Russia are more egregious in the way they deal with this concept of sort of power behind the scenes and propaganda and covert operations, but I'm afraid that virtually all countries around the world engage in it. So with that, let me start again.
Ambassador Shinn, maybe I'll jump right in there if that's okay.
I'm going to turn it over to you right now, Chris.
Okay, thanks so much. So maybe I'll start just responding to a couple of observations that Elena Benabdallah made. And I think I noted that she made the observations that the deans in Addis Ababa know exactly what they're giving up when they come to an agreement with Confucius Institutes. And I just wonder whether giving up full expression, discussions on certain issues is something that should be on the table. And I would really emphasize the fact, I know we're focused on Africa, and Africa has enormous differentiation among cases, whether we're talking about China's engagement in Zimbabwe, which is already an authoritarian regime, and you have an authoritarian to authoritarian patron relationship. But I think also looking at developments in countries like Ghana and Senegal, where there's more openness, and many of our partners and interlocutors there express real concerns about the degree to which free expression is being curbed or otherwise curtailed through engagement with China in the ways that Dave, Shulman, and others have discussed. So that's one thing. And I would say that in the case of, and I'll use the Alliance Française and the Goethe Institute examples, I just don't think that giving up free expression is a part of the equation when local interlocutors, whether this is in Latin America, Southeastern Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, it's simply not a part of the deal. And it is in these engagements with China, as we're discovering, with greater frequency. So that's one thing I would say. And I'd also agree with you. I don't think we're in disagreement that the way to address this is to make sure that local agency is strong enough to make to understand the issues and to make a choice. So I know my colleagues in Central Europe, which are deeply engaged with China now, are racing to get up to speed to understand what exactly China's foreign policy entails and how they're engaging on these issues of democratic integrity. And it's very difficult, in part because there isn't necessarily local expertise on China, the Chinese Communist Party, and China's foreign policy in all of these settings, whether we're talking about Africa or other parts of the world. And it's one of the things that we've emphasized in all of our writing, that strengthening local capacity so that local actors can assess for themselves the risks and rewards of engagement with China. And I would stress with Russia, for that matter, Russia engages in a very similar way through local elites to the exclusion of civil society. And I would really stress this point just to be responsive to Ambassador Shinn's question. I think, when the concept of sharp power took hold in the early 1990s at the end of the Cold War, most of the writing on this revolved around sharp power being a function of both state engagement, but also, as Joe Nye wrote, through vibrant, independent civil society. And there is no vibrant, independent civil society coming out of the Chinese party state management of China's engagement in these settings. So when we talk about Star Times, when we talk about the tech companies that run all of Ethiopia's tech environment, which is the case today, there are no others other than ZTE and Huawei, we have to reflect on whether that, as a systemic issue, can enable pluralism and discussion. And so finally, let me just address one or two other issues that were raised. I think, the term sharp power, I'm delighted we're discussing it here, because all too often over the years, soft power was the default for every form of non-kinetic engagement that was undertaken by states. And if you do a content search of soft power in China, you'll find that it was uniformly used that way with Russia as well. And I think having this debate, a legitimate one, about what the effects of this engagement are on free expression and democratic integrity is useful, even if you disagree with the term. I think it's extremely useful to have this discussion and let people come to their own conclusions. And so today we have activists and scholars in Hong Kong and Taiwan that now use the term, as well as many others. And I think that's a good thing. I think we should debate it. I'm delighted to be here today, but I also think it's not healthy to just remain in a fixed way of thinking. For example, thinking that 2020 is the same as 1980. I think this is a real struggle for people to maybe think outside of a Cold War mindset at a time when we're no longer in the Cold War and we're dealing with a much more diverse and differentiated forms of influence and power. So thanks for the opportunity to respond.
Thank you, Christopher, and on to Lina.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'll make a few remarks. Maybe just responding very briefly about the point that Chris brought up around what is being given up. And here, I mean, I think the sense that I'm getting is that it's mostly really a pragmatic relationship where, you may have 5 different curriculum, proposals, but if you don't have the infrastructure where you're going to teach it and the staff and the material and the equipment and everything else around it, it's not going to teach by itself. And I think that this was the omitted part when I was talking earlier about, how African or at least Ethiopian higher education officials that were speaking to were really, they knew what they were getting into. And this was precisely not necessarily being the ones who are setting, the curriculum, or not being the ones hiring for the teachers. But, at the same time, if you don't have that institute, you're just not going to have, much use for, for a curriculum that I don't know where it comes from. But I think this brings me to my larger point, which is to say there's a very important aspect of this conversation that I think would be very productive and fruitful to delve in a little bit. And this is the topic of shaping the narrative and the different tactics that are used by Chinese state and other states to shape the narrative. Of course, connected to this is knowledge production. And I don't think that knowledge is neutral, whatever knowledge it is, or whichever curriculum or whoever curriculum is going to be neutral. But I think it's really important to basically understand a bit more about these trainings that we all talked about briefly, or these exchanges, the people-to-people exchanges, trainings of journalists, trainings of students, student scholarships, etc. What are all the aspects that make these so important and so attractive to Africans, because they participate in these willingly and they apply to participate in these willingly. They're not necessarily just dragged in or coercively, involved in these scholarships or these engagements. And I think that in my book, I speak about relational power. I speak about build in networks, and I speak about build in sort of social capital between Chinese journalists and officials and public servants and their African counterparts, and this is really important. So that report is important. Having that exchanges is not just about the outcome, it's actually about the process itself. It's about the connections that are built, it's about the network that's being expanded, and a lot of that comes from the personal relational aspect of it. It's not, sort of this mechanical, but it's actually very dynamic training programs that, invite participants, treat them very well and respectably, and treat them as agents and as equals, and make them feel that they are really part of this knowledge production conversation about, how do we think about, governance, or how do we think about, reporting, or how do we think about any number of other topics. I think this is very important. Understanding how these trainings work, what goes in them, is very important to really grasp why are Africans participating in this so willingly, and why are they think very that these trainings are attractive, and their numbers increase yearly. And I think I'll wrap up for this second round, and I look forward to more conversation around this. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lina, and over to David.
Well, thanks very much. A really interesting conversation so far. I just want to touch on a few key points I think that came up from Jamie and Jude's comments. First, in terms of when we talk about China's influence, I make it a point, and I know a lot of people who are working on these issues make it a point to never talk about it in the terms of the Chinese people. I mean, this is very much about the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese government, its Leninist system, its neo-totalitarian system at home, and how that is affecting countries around the world. This is not about the however many hundreds of thousands or even a million individual Chinese setting up businesses in Africa. It's not about, I work on this globally. We're very sensitive when we're looking at, for instance, what's happening in Southeast Asia, Central Asia, given the history of anti-Chinese ethnic violence there, to make sure that this is about what the PRC, the Chinese Communist Party, is doing, and it's not about the Chinese people or any type of stereotypes around them. Secondly, I think it was well noted that this is both, I think, it's important to look at what's happening in Africa and within individual African countries, because the context is critical, and how China operates in individual countries is always unique and different. But it's also important to put it in a global context. So, I think Jude made the point that countries in Africa are kind of, focused parochially, but I would make it the argument that that's the case everywhere, right? Looking at Latin America, but also looking in Asia. And so the difference in a lot of respects is where Chinese strategic interests lie, and where, the kind of tactics that China is employing to advance its strategic interests in many countries around the world, and the response to them are a byproduct of the extent to which China determines that it has deep strategic interests in countries, and the response that it gets from them. So I think that's an important aspect to note. And I would say too, in response to Jamie's comments, this isn't about, the particular weakness of African leaders. At least, I haven't seen those types of adjectives thrown around. But, I think when we talk about what China has achieved in places in Asia, where the level of influence and interference is much greater than it has been thus far in Africa, I think talking about why Hun Sen has been exuberant and accepting of China's influence and interference, and what that's done to Cambodia's democracy. Looking at what's happened in Laos, in Pakistan, in any number of countries that where you can talk about the leaders and their willingness to accept China's influence and interference, and arguably their entire awareness of what they're getting into. I don't think it's an Africa-specific question. And I think, on that point about looking at places like Asia, I think, in most African countries, it's still relatively early days when we look at what's happening in terms of sharp power. And that's because of China's limited strategic interests in many countries, even though those economic interests are growing. And so I think it's really instructive to look at what has happened in Taiwan, to look at what has happened in Australia, to look at what has happened in the countries that I just mentioned in Southeast Asia, any number of countries in Europe, to see what does happen when China's strategic interests are at risk, and where they feel that the Chinese Party state feels that it does need to really ramp up what it's doing. And so I think that's That's really important to look at. And I know my time is up, but I'll just say, in terms of building resilience, taking the lessons about transparency, about the importance, as Chris mentioned, of real expertise on the Chinese Communist Party and its sharp power tactics, which are not easily understood anywhere, including in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, and Europe. So this is not an Africa-specific problem. It's a problem that is global. So I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much, David. Gyude, up to you.
Thank you again. And David, I think I agree with that point that, and that's why I stressed for African governments, it's important to see what happens, how China responds when that narrative is challenged, especially when it's challenged by other governments, and see what China does, because it'll help them in terms of how that the relationship with China is not all rosy. But I think I wanted to make 3 points that, on the question of sharp power, it is usually about one, external intrusion into domestic policy. It is about advancing a model of governance that is different from, say, a democratic and open society. And it is about supposedly the erosion of certain shared values, say democracy. And so what I'm seeing is that language tends to be used largely because, so for former colonies, for smaller countries and weak powers, what has been basically the experience since independence and pre-independence, where more powerful states impose their values upon them, more powerful states impose their influence on them. We're now seeing a non-Western state begin to exert that same kind of influence in Western societies. And I think there's this jolt that something that has been preserved for the weaker countries of the world is now actually been happening in the West. And so the West is responding to that. And so I want to bring back the point that, one, for us on whom this is an actor, for us who are interacting with external actors, it's hard to see the distinction between China and China's activity on the continent and, say, US drone bases on the continent. There are 13 external forces that have military bases in Africa, including China. So the arrival of China is just the newest of a long train of external actors acting on the continent. And so, again, it's difficult for us to see the difference between propaganda and public diplomacy. It's difficult for us to see the difference between sticks and carrots and sharp power or coercive diplomacy, especially from the perspective of those who are responding to that. The final thing that I would say is that Afrobarometer did a survey of over 35 countries on the continent, and overwhelmingly, over 60% of the survey respondents were more interested in the country becoming more democratic. And so even as China is trying to expand this narrative, there are forces acting in African politics that are going counter to whatever it is China is trying to do. And so as we talk about China's influence and China's sharp power or China's promotion of a certain narrative, it's important to also take into account what is happening within African countries themselves and the agency that it gives and the strength of civil society. And I think the final thing that I will say on this, and then I'll go because it's supposed to be 3 minutes, is that in a combination of these two things, it is important to understand that for the countries that respond most, the partners that respond to what the needs are for African governments, there is going to be an affinity for those. So as most of the West have departed from Zimbabwe because it is autocratic, it's only opened the space for China to become more influential in Zimbabwe. So I think it's the balancing of that, of understanding that China's presence may not be viewed with alarm by African countries because this is just the newest in a long line of external actors who've come on the continent. And so the way Africans view China and respond to China is always going to be completely different from the way the West does and responds to it.
Thank you very much, Gyude. And Jamie, you have the last word before we move to Q&A, and we have a lot of Q&A, so let's move along quickly now.
Thank you very much, David. I wanted to just say a couple of words. I appreciated Lina bringing in the question of materialities, and Gyude also talking about proximate issues in foreign policy, so that the hierarchy of values where people are making these trade-offs might look different from the position of a dean at the University of Addis Ababa and someone sitting in Washington or someone sitting even in Laos. And I think that's really what I'm not hearing is that for whom is this free expression the top #1 priority that should guide foreign policy, and how. Just another comment, you know, you invoked, or sorry, some of the speakers invoked Emeka Umeje, whose work I actually see as promoting an idea of journalists recognizing the tensions and challenges and trying to negotiate, not throwing out one model or the other, but finding a negotiated space and working to develop some agency there. So that's really what I took away from that, not that this person is supporting an argument about sharp power. But lastly, I want to say that in the 2017 and 2018 publications that Chris put forward, there's a big part of it that I actually wholeheartedly support. And that is that Africans and African countries do need to know more about China and be well educated about China. And I just want to tell you about one institution that I feel is really a model for this, and I would love to see this taken up elsewhere. At the University of Botswana, there's an independent Department of Chinese Studies where Botswanans are determining how Chinese language and culture, almost like an area studies center model, should be taught and used, and what the service would be of such an education to the country of Botswana. They're training language teachers that are already going out to secondary schools and other community educational institutions, building a cohort of Botswanans learning Chinese who can get those jobs, working in Chinese firms, for governments, getting involved in entrepreneurial activities, traveling to China with their own understanding that's coming from this Department of Chinese Studies. There is a CI at UB. It is funded, of course, and supported in some of the ways that other CIs are supported, and they collaborate together. They're not rivals, they work together. The CI is much better resourced. But this is a kind of model that I think has value. I hope people take a look at it. I hope this kind of knowledge production, and we don't, you know, it's not us going to help Africans get resilience. They're already getting resilience. And these are the kinds of spaces that we need to start paying attention to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Let's move right into the questions. The first one is from Hagan Sabiri. The question is to three people, to Deborah, David, and Lina. Do you think China's capacity building activities and emphasis on exchange of development experience with African countries is China's alternative approach to helping build the development capacity of African countries to spearhead their own development agenda, or such activities are just a soft power to promoting the China model to African countries? If you could be very brief in your answer, since it's to three different people, and Deborah, if you're on board there, do you want to begin with that?
Thanks very much for that question. It's very difficult to analyze all of these capacity building activities because they're hugely varied. And some of them are, I think, basically ways to showcase China's development experience and introduce people to that, which is a way of building, I think, China's soft power and its attractiveness. Some of them are genuine efforts to train people in particular skills. So they could be quite extensive leather tannery expertise, and which also could be related to Chinese businesses' efforts to showcase their technology to build markets. And then, of course, there are the university training experiences where people can go and get university degrees, both at the undergraduate and the graduate level. And these can be in technical fields. So agriculture is one that I've studied in the past. So I think there's a huge variety there, and there's no one simple answer to that question.
Thank you, Deborah. David.
Thanks. Great question, and I agree with Deborah. Yeah, I think there's a huge variety, and I think soft power, or just kind of a perception of China as ruled by the Chinese Communist Party as entirely legitimate and having its own legitimate approach to development and to politics and governance is a big part of it in individual countries. I would say too, I think it's important to take the macro look as well at what China's doing globally on this. I mean, Xi Jinping at the 19th Party Congress in 2017 said that China was offering an alternative model for countries around the world that want to speed up their development. So, you know, essentially putting forward something that goes towards delinking democracy and development at a much more macro normative level, right? And so I think that that's really important to keep in mind. And one of China's main goals in terms of its approach to global order is essentially to, as we've said, not necessarily instill a Chinese Communist Party Marxist-Leninist view for the world, but to essentially unseat liberal norms and democratic values and universal human rights from the place that they currently hold in the international order. So that's kind of the macro view. And then I'd say, just beyond that, on the ground, we are seeing not just the sorts of trainings we've talked about, but we're even seeing China starting to creep into, you know, being election monitors and passing judgment on the legitimacy of elections in places like Cambodia. So I think going forward, we're going to see more and more of a kind of competing. You know, China has its own development agency now. We're going to see more of a China competing in the governance space to say, well, the West might say that this election went this way, but we have a different vision of what's happening and transpiring in individual countries, not necessarily based upon the presumption that democracy has to be the answer all the time. So I'll stop
Thank
there.
you, David. Over to you, Lina.
I think Deborah and David covered most of it. We can move on to the next question. Otherwise, I would just be reiterating what's been said. So I'm good.
Thank you very much. The next question is from Ken Colangelo, and he asks Jude Moore, is the reason it might be difficult to see how China is acting differently than France or the United States because the Chinese loans these African governments owe are hidden, but the ones from Western countries are not?
I mean, it could be. One of the things, most commentators and analysts who've spoken about Chinese lending to the continent, one of the things that we've all talked about was the opacity of some of the terms, right? And the language that says that the terms cannot be revealed without prior written consent of the Chinese party. And I think, you know, whenever there's an absence of transparency, it invites abuse. But I don't know if, say, for example, AFD or KFW publishes all of the details of the bilateral loans. I don't know. I know the World Bank and multilateral institutions do. And it's also possible because most of the Western countries have they have freedom of information laws, and so if one wanted to get copies of those documents, they probably could. There are channels through which one could do that, and so I'm not sure that every bilateral partner publishes all of the details. I mean, I know like I said, for the Western side, they might have mechanisms for you to be able to access them if you wanted to, and those may not exist on the Chinese side. However, I would just give an example from my time in government. The government of Liberia, we have laws that say that when the government of Liberia signs onto a loan or takes of that kind, it has to be ratified in the legislature. And the legislature, a law is not considered a law until it's been printed into handbills. So there's no possibility in Liberian law of signing an agreement with anyone, whether it's China or the African Development Bank or the World Bank, where the details will be a secret. So I think it's also important while we stress that the Chinese side needs to be more open, we also need to stress with the African side that they can make the systems open if they want to. So I just said, when you see the power disparity between China and Liberia, it's massive, but Liberian law prevents Chinese loans in Liberia from being secret. They have to be open. And so I think it's both sides in terms of, and so as we emphasize African agency, it's also important for African governments to be able to exercise that.
Thank you very much, Judy. The next question is from Maggie Zheng. It's really directed at everyone. Everyone could comment on it, but I think I'm going to ask Lina to respond to this one for the sake of time. Thank you for raising the importance of the Africa perspective. From your research and observation, what is the perspective from the Chinese side? Any major different views you have observed on China's engagement in Africa from scholars, research, and business views?
I think it's probably goes back to what David earlier said about what we define as China as an actor in this case. I mean, if we think about it as the CCP, the Chinese state, sort of the funding agencies for these sponsorship or scholarships, etc. I mean, I think the rhetoric on the ground is that these scholarships and people-to-people relations and Confucius Institutes, etc., are all one way to show China's commitment to its, friendly historic relations with Africans, and that the Chinese state sort of, cares about development, cares about human development, human capital development in Africa. And I don't know that I see a major view. There is a major, difference in these views. I mean, I don't know if I'm understanding the question correctly either, but that's what my understanding of it is. Also, there's a train passing, so I'm just going to mute myself because it would be very loud.
Thank you for that. The next question is from Emma Schleifer, and it's to all panelists, but maybe we could ask Christopher to deal with this. If one of the others of you wishes to weigh in, let me know. It says, what can the U.S. learn from China about how to harness its private sector to improve its soft power messaging?
So maybe I'll answer the question in the following way. I think many of the speakers have alluded to the fact that China, under the CCP, is investing considerable resources in many places, in Africa and elsewhere. And I think one of the things that democracies need to reflect on is how to make investments that offer an alternative. And I really agree with this. I think the challenge, and what I've emphasized in my writing and my argument, is that it's not that, as I think some of the speakers have suggested, that these resources should be turned away. It's that there should be the local capacity to make an assessment of what the conditions are under which they're accepted. And I would really take issue with this idea that freedom of expression has to be sacrificed. I think what we're seeing now globally are liberal arts colleges in advanced democracies, other institutions and young democracies everywhere struggling with these decisions while they look at these important resources to learn the Chinese language, learn about Chinese culture, but understanding that they may have to sidestep discussions of Tibet, Taiwan, Xinjiang, and other things as China's strategic interests grow and the PRC becomes emboldened to set aside certain issues. And so I think one of the things that democracies, not just the United States, but I think all democracies that are engaging globally need to do is to think about enhancing their own transparency and adhering to their own values to offer a clear and positive example abroad. And I think over a period of many years now, we've become much weaker at that. And I think that's something we really need to reflect hard on, because you can't compete with something with nothing or with a limited scope of investments. And so I really just stress to finalize this point. I think some people have suggested, and maybe imputing things to my writings or my ideas, that people should turn away the resources that come to them. I don't think that's a fair assessment. I think it's incredibly hard for chief development officers at major universities in advanced democracies to do that, and they typically don't, by the way, as well as it's the case for administrators in the global south to contend with these things. The question is, what sort of levels of integrity will be understood by the community to be things that need to be in place and adhered to, so that we don't see a steady erosion of free expression, transparency, academic freedom, just to use those examples over time.
Thank you, Christopher. The next question is from Jean-Pierre Cabestan, and it's actually to everyone, but I'm going to ask for a volunteer for this one. I know several of you can deal with it, but for the sake of time, I'd rather that not everyone comment on it. It says, to all panelists, there is one aspect of China's sharp power that has not been discussed at all: economic influence and its ability to increase African countries' dependence upon it through multiple loans and the construction of a large number of infrastructure projects. Could I get a volunteer for that one? Anyone want to leap out? Deborah, go ahead.
We usually look at the aspect of economic things like loans and economic inducements as part of hard power. So because countries can offer these as a carrot and they can withdraw them, that's the sharp part of that hard power. So it's an inducement that can be removed. And so in that sense, it's already covered under hard power. So it obviously, countries do this for a number of different reasons. To have business engagement is how I see the largest. It's promoting Chinese business interests. But it can be used as well to promote other kinds of interests. And certainly China's foreign aid program, what we see as the actual zero interest loans and the other grants that the Chinese government uses, these are largely for diplomatic purposes. And that's why they're spread across all of Africa and not targeted to particular countries, so that China can build its soft power using those tools.
Thank you, Deborah. I want to get Jamie involved in this. There's a question for her. It's from someone who already asked a question, but I want to go forward with it, from Maggie Zhang. Jamie, thank you for the historical review and Western dominant study Ray concepts. How can we bring different parties, Western, African, and Chinese, together to start the conversation and research on some common ground, such as well-being of human society, so the different parties are not talking in a silo?
Thank you, Maggie, for your question. And I did intend to say something about your earlier question. You know, we didn't have a Chinese scholar in this roundtable, and of course, the Chinese scholar is not a uniform voice at all globally. But I do agree with you. I think it's really important to get different parties together and hear from different perspectives. And I really believe that networks and building communities that can develop research collaboratively is the way to go. And I want to point out that SAIS-CARI is one of the most important global spaces where this happens. Our China-Africa Research Network is another, and I think we can do more. There are scholars at African Studies Institutes in China that do wonderful work, like my colleague Liu Haifang has written about cultural diplomacy, for example, in some very important ways. So I encourage going forward the building of robust, again, networks of experienced researchers so that we can work together and not either be in silos or worse, to be in competition with one another. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. I think the next question may be best suited to Gyude. It's from Mikatikiso Kubayi. I think what's missing here are comments on the attitudes and perceptions of Africans on the question, on the history of relations with the West. Consider structural adjustment programs and their consequences, military and other hard power use, and so on. There also seems to be a perception that African elites, policymakers, and negotiators are immature or not capable of thinking for themselves, and thus in need of saving. What are Africans themselves saying?
Well, in my comments, I try to allude to that you know, the arrival of the Chinese is just the most recent in a long train of external actors arriving on the continent and influencing the continent's policy. It was 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago that the family of the former prime minister of the DRC of Congo, his tooth was being restored to his family from Belgium because he was killed by the Belgians and with CIA cooperation. The history of Africa is replete with such negative actions from external actors there. And so that Africans will suddenly become alarmed by the presence of China. I don't know. Again, I mentioned the Afrobarometer. They just did a survey. And China, in terms of perception among African citizens, still ranks pretty high. High is China in the United States. Is the United States 1 and China 2 in terms of how Africans see China. So, but I think it's also important for us to keep in mind that all of these relationships, whether they're with China or they're with other Western actors or with the Gulf states who are now expanding their influence on the continent, or India or Turkey, that all of these actors on the continent come in pursuit of their own interests. So it's important for Africans in determining what their interests are to engage in the kinds of partnerships that they want. That, China is not on the continent in pursuit of altruistic goals. Neither is the United States, for that matter. So I think it's important that when African governments, especially those who are acting on behalf of the African people, do so, first, that it is a reflection of their desire, as we've seen in surveys, but also that it's a reflection of interests that are important to Africa. The final thing I would say before I get off is on the question of whether creating dependence in Africans on China. Before the arrival of Chinese contractors and Chinese firms on the continent, almost all of the construction, almost all of the capital equipment came from the West. It meant if you needed parts, if you needed training, if you needed anything, you had to go back. So it's just exactly the same thing that the Chinese are doing. I think it's important that as we have these conversations, that we do not other China, because China is a rising power and doing things that rising powers do, and doing things that powerful countries have always done. Now, they might do it in peculiar ways and ways that are different. We're open to having that conversation about those differences. But for us on on the continent where this is happening, it's not as alarming as it might be, say, in Australia or in Iowa.
Thank you, Jude. And I think we're at the last question before we get to the bewitching hour, probably best directed to both David and Christopher. It's from Andrea Ngombe, and it's, could we say that the difference between China and the United States and Africa is the accountability of the US government and judicial system? If each of you could respond to that, please. David, starting with you.
Well, I would say that the biggest difference that you can point to just quickly is the fundamental nature of the two different governments. And that's not to say that America doesn't have its problems, and we all know that it does, right? Democracies have problems, and we're seeing that in real time. But to look at how the Chinese Communist Party operates and how it operates both at home and abroad, and how it views control over information, how it views willingness to engage with elites and to disperse corruption as part and parcel of a lot of the investment deals that it's engaging in. I think that is kind of the fundamental difference between the US and China. And I think, to zero in on the information space, and I get this question a lot, what's the difference? You look at US sponsored media outlets like Voice of America, or you look at others, you're going to see critical commentary and coverage of what's happening in the United States, of what's happening in democracies, of what's happening in terms of US engagement around the world. You will not see that on CGTV or CGTN. And you will not hear those words coming out of Chinese Communist Party sponsored think tanks and scholars, which unfortunately now the space for discussion and debate inside China and outside China with those who live in the PRC is effectively gone. So that's the difference. And you can look at what's happened in Hong Kong with the new national security law, what's happened with China trying to shape debate and control information increasingly globally outside its borders. I think that to me is the main difference, but I could spend quite a bit of time talking about this, but I know we're limited. I'll turn it over to Chris.
Christopher, over to you. Thank you, David.
So I think in its own way, it's unfortunate that these discussions tend to default to a kind of great power competition using China and the US as the points of reference, which in and of itself gives the African people less agency, these kinds of discussions. I think what we really should be focused on are the effects of the engagement that are coming from these powerful actors, the opacity with which the engagement may lead to, say, systematic media agreements or other investments. And Deborah BRAUTIGAM mentioned that the commercial investments coming from China can be seen as hard power. I might not agree with that, but I think more important are the effects of the process and the engagement of these investments. And if it's the case that these investments then tend to either repurpose certain independent institutions for CCP preferences or otherwise sideline discussions or not have a meaningful public debate among civil society, then I think that isn't hard power. That's actually suppressing discussion in ways that we need to reflect on. And this is happening, I'd really like to stress this point at the end. This isn't just a question in Africa. As Dave mentioned, it's early days in Africa because many of the forms of engagement that we're starting to see are very nascent. When we look to East Asia and Central Europe and other parts of the world where this engagement is deeply joined and where politicians and media outlets and institutions are already compromised in many ways, in ways that are being reported by a whole host of people: Sarah Cook, Marika Ohlberg, Samantha Hoffman, Nadej Roland, all of these fantastic scholars who are putting material into the public domain in the recent past especially. I think we really need to reflect on what the kind of non-kinetic forms of influence mean in these settings when they suppress certain forms of debate or otherwise compromise institutions, not for us, but for the societies that are deeply engaged with China, Russia, and increasingly the Gulf powers, who don't always privilege pluralism, free expression, and democratic integrity in the way they engage with local actors. So maybe I'll finish with that.
Thank you very much, Christopher. And before I turn this back to Deborah for closing out the session, I just want to thank all of the speakers today. I think this was a high-level discussion, and I think there was some controversy on it, which I was trying to inject from the beginning. So thank all of you for participating, and Deborah, over to you.
Thank you. I want to also thank all of the panelists. This is exactly the kind of lively discussion and exchange that we were hoping for with this roundtable, which was the first time that we've done something like this at our annual conference. So we appreciate this. Great thanks to all of you. And I feel actually encouraged thinking about this historically, because I remember how the World Bank and the IMF were similarly pictured during the structural adjustment period in the 1980s and 1990s, and how that effort to kind of impose a different kind of governance system, we might say, the privatization and the ideas of how government ought to work, was very strongly resisted by many parts of African civil society in a much less democratic period. So I think I'm encouraged that African civil society is even stronger now than it was back then. And I imagine that they're going to be illustrating this in the future. So it's a more optimistic view of this. So let me say that we are continuing our annual conference. Tomorrow we'll have a session on peacekeeping and humanitarian programs. And the day after that, we've got commercial interests in private security companies. And then our final panel on Friday with regional actors, multipolarity, and comparative perspectives. So thank you again, and see you tomorrow.